"Stand straight, runt," the slave driver barked, his whip cracking against the cold iron of the cage. I was the last lot of the night, a defective shifter who couldn't find her wolf. The glittering nobles of the Iron Citadel looked at me with bored disgust. "A waste of space," one duchess sneered. "She doesn't even have a scent." I lowered my head, my fingers gripping the frayed edges of my mother's locket. No one wanted a wolf who couldn't hunt. No one wanted me. Until the heavy oak doors groaned open and the world went cold. The Iron Citadel smelled of burnt tallow, expensive perfume, and the metallic tang of fear. It was a place where the powerful came to buy the lives of the broken. I stood on the raised wooden dais, the rough hemp of my tunic itching against my skin, shivering under the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes. I was 21 years old, and in the world of the shifters, I was a ghost. Most children experience their first shift at 13. I had spent nearly a decade waiting for the crack of bone and the sprout of fur that never came. My own pack, the Crimson Peak, had traded me away for a week's worth of grain and silver. To them, an unmated female who couldn't shift was just an extra mouth to feed. "Lot 49, the auctioneer droned, his voice oily and thin. "A female, age 21. Docile. No scent? No shift. Starting bid at 10 silver pieces." A ripple of mocking laughter went through the hall. "10 silver for a human in a wolf's skin?" someone shouted from the back. "I wouldn't pay 5 copper for a pup that can't grow teeth." I kept my gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. The humiliation was a dull ache I had long ago learned to live with. I was the broken lot, the girl no one wanted. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. I just wanted it to be over. If no one bought me, I would be sent to the salt mines, a death sentence for someone with my small stature. The auctioneer looked around, his face reddening with frustration. "No bidders. 10 silver. She can cook. She can clean." Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the dust on my cheek. "Mother," I whispered in my mind, "is this where it ends?" Then, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound, but a pressure. A sudden, bone-chilling cold swept through the hall, extinguishing the torches nearest to the entrance. The laughter died instantly. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open, they seemed to submit, groaning on their hinges as they swung wide. A man stepped into the light. He was tall, broader than any shifter I had ever seen, wrapped in a heavy cloak of raven fur. His skin was the color of moonlight, and his eyes, piercing, crystalline silver, seemed to hold the weight of the night sky. This was Kieran, the Alpha King of the Shadow Throne, the man who ruled the northern wastes, the one they called the King of Scars. The auctioneer's gavel slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The nobles who had been laughing moments ago now shrank into their seats, baring their throats in an instinctive gesture of submission. Kieran didn't look at them. He walked down the center aisle, his heavy boots thumping rhythmically against the stone. He stopped at the foot of the dais and looked up. For a moment, his silver eyes locked onto mine. There was no pity in them, no disgust. There was a strange, silent intensity that made my breath catch. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a single, heavy coin. It wasn't silver. It was black gold, stamped with the sigil of a shattered moon. He tossed it onto the stage. It landed with a dull thud that sounded like a heartbeat. 1,000 black gold, Kieran said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in my very chest. The auctioneer stammered, his eyes bulging. My lord, that is enough to buy the entire citadel. For a lot like her?" "She is no longer a lot," Kieran stated, his voice turning like whetted steel. "She is mine, Unchain her." The shackles were removed with trembling hands. I stepped down from the dais, my legs feeling like lead. I expected him to lead me away like a prize, to hand me over to a guard. Instead, Kieran took off his heavy raven cloak and draped it around my shoulders. It was warm, smelling of pine needles, snow, and something uniquely him, the scent of a storm just before it breaks. "Can you walk, Alara?" he asked quietly. I flinched at the sound of my name. No one had used it in years. I think so, my lord." "Then walk with me," he said. "The Shadow Throne is a long journey, and we have much to discuss." The ride back to the Northern Kingdom was spent in a carriage draped in dark velvet. Kieran sat across from me, silent and watchful. I expected him to demand things from me, to explain why he had spent a fortune on a wolf who couldn't shift. But he only watched the snow begin to fall outside the window. When we finally reached the moon-shattered peak, the fortress didn't look like the dark, terrifying place the stories described. It was a massive structure of obsidian and ice, carved into the very side of a mountain. It felt ancient, protective. Kieran led me through the halls, his servants bowing with genuine respect, not the fearful groveling I had seen at the Citadel. We stopped before a set of double doors carved from white birch. "This will be your room," Kieran said. I stepped inside and gasped. It was beautiful. A fire crackled in a hearth of blue stone. The bed was covered in soft wool and furs, and there were shelves filled with books and jars of dried herbs. It wasn't a cell. It was a home. "I don't understand," I whispered, turning to face him. I clutched the raven cloak tighter around me. "Why did you buy me? I have no scent. I can't shift. I am a defect. You could have had any high-born female in the realms." Kieran stepped into the room, the firelight catching the sharp line of his jaw and the jagged scar that ran from his temple to his cheek. He looked at me with an expression that was almost empathetic. "They see what they want to see, Alara," he said softly. "They see a lack of shift and assume weakness. They see a lack of scent and assume a lack of soul. But I see what you are hiding, even from yourself." He reached out, his hand hovering near my face, before he hesitated and pulled it back. "You were not bought to be a servant, Ilara," he continued. "You were brought here because the Shadow Throne needs a queen who understands what it means to be broken. And because your blood carries a secret that the Iron Citadel would kill to possess." My heart skipped a beat. My blood? I'm just an orphan of the Crimson Peak. "No," Kieran said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "You are the daughter of the lunar eclipse, and your journey is only beginning." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Rest now. Tomorrow, the court will want to meet you. They will be looking for a reason to doubt you. Do not give it to them." As the door clicked shut, I sat on the edge of the bed, the warmth of the fire seeping into my bones. For the first time in my life, I wasn't Lot 49. I wasn't a runt. But the weight of his words, daughter of the lunar eclipse, felt like a heavy crown I wasn't ready to wear. I looked at my reflection in the window, a pale girl in a king's cloak, and felt a sudden, terrifying shift in the wind. The first week at the Shadow Throne was a blur of silver snow and obsidian hallways. Every morning, I woke in the softest bed I had ever known, only to be met by the cold, assessing stares of the Northern Court. Kieran had provided me with everything: warm clothes, rich food, and the safety of his walls. But he could not buy the pack's acceptance. To the high-born shifters of the North, I was a ghost gift, a curiosity, a king's expensive whim. "She doesn't even eat like a wolf," I heard a maid whisper as I sat in the great hall, picking at a plate of roasted venison. "She nibbles like a rabbit. How is she to bear the king's airs if she can't even handle the scent of blood?" I kept my head down. the emerald silk of my new gown feeling like a costume. Kieran sat at the head of the table, his presence a silent shield. He didn't speak much, but whenever the murmurs grew too loud, he would simply set his wine goblet down with a sharp thud, and the room would plunge into an uneasy silence. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the library looking for a book on herbology. I had always been better with plants than with people. In my old pack, I was the one who stitched up the warrior's wounds because I couldn't be out there making them. "The king is a dreamer, you know," a voice said from behind a tall shelf. I turned to see a woman with hair like spun silver and eyes of a sharp, piercing violet. She was Lady Vane, a member of the High Council and, according to the gossip, the woman everyone had expected Kieran to marry. "Lady Vane," I said, curtsying as I had been taught. "Oh, stop that," she said, waving a hand. She stepped closer, her scent, sharp like peppermint and ozone, filling the air. "I don't hate you, Alara. I pity you. You are a human heart beating in a wolf's den. Eventually, the cold will get to you." "The king says I have a purpose here," I replied, trying to keep my voice from trembling. Vane smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Kieran is obsessed with the old prophecies. He thinks your lack of a shift is a sign of unawakened power. But look at you. You're pale, you're shaking, and you can't even smell the betrayal in this room." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But there is a way to help you, a way to prove them all wrong. If you want a shift, if you want to show Kieran you were worth the gold, you need the frostbite bloom." My heart leaped. I had heard stories of the bloom, a rare flower that grew only on the highest peaks, said to trigger the primal instinct in even the weakest shifters. "It grows in the silent crevasse," Vane continued. "If you bring it back tonight and present it to the council, they will have no choice but to respect you. Kieran would be so proud." I knew it was dangerous. I knew I shouldn't trust her. But the hunger to be enough, to repay Kieran for saving me from the auction block, was a fire in my veins. I didn't want to be a burden. I wanted to be a queen. The mistake was born from that desperation. I didn't tell Kieran. I didn't tell the guards. I waited until the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue. Wrapped in the raven cloak Kieran had given me, I slipped out of the side postern gate and into the biting cold of the mountain. The silent crevasse was miles away, a jagged tear in the mountainside, where the wind howled like 1,000 lost souls. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the air was so thin it felt like breathing glass. Every step was a battle. My human lungs burned, and my fingers went numb despite the heavy fur. "I can do this," I whispered to myself, my teeth chattering. "I'm a wolf. I just haven't found the way yet." I reached the mouth of the crevasse as the moon, a perfect, pale orb, rose over the summit. And there, clinging to the edge of a precipice, was the bloom. It glowed with a faint, ethereal blue light, its petals crystalline and beautiful. I reached for it, my boots slipping on the treacherous ice. Below me, the crevasse yawned like a black throat. "Alara, stop." The voice was a whisper in my mind, soft and warm, like a summer breeze in the middle of a blizzard. It sounded like my mother. I froze, my hand inches from the flower. I looked around, but there was only the snow and the shadows. "Mother," I breathed. Suddenly, the ground beneath me groaned. The ice didn't just crack, it shattered. I screamed as I tumbled into the darkness, the raven cloak fluttering around me like broken wings. I didn't hit the bottom. I caught a jagged ledge halfway down, my fingers clawing at the frozen stone. Above me, at the lip of the crevasse, a shadow appeared. It wasn't Kieran. It was Lady Vane, her violet eyes looking down at me with cold satisfaction. "I told you the cold would get to you, little ghost," she called out, her voice echoing off the ice walls. "The king doesn't need a miracle. He needs a lesson in reality." She turned and vanished into the snow, leaving me hanging over the abyss. My strength was failing, the numbness crawling up my arms. I looked up at the moon, my vision blurring. I had tried to prove I was a wolf, and in doing so, I had proven exactly what they said I was. A girl who didn't belong. The ice under my fingers began to give way. I closed my eyes, the cold finally reaching my heart. "I'm sorry, Kieran," I whispered. Just as my grip slipped, a terrifying, primal roar shook the entire mountain. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. A massive, black shape silhouetted against the moon, leaping across the gap with impossible grace. I felt a hand, massive, warm and solid, grab my wrist just as I plummeted. I looked up, gasping, into the silver eyes of the Alpha King. He wasn't in his human form. He was mid-shift, his face a terrifying mask of man and beast, his claws digging into the ice to anchor us both. "Alara!" he barked, the sound more of a growl than a word. He hauled me up with a strength that defied the storm, slamming me against his broad, fur-covered chest. He was trembling, not from the cold, but from rage. "You fool!" he hissed into my hair as the blizzard raged around us. "You could have died for a weed." I wanted to be a wolf," I sobbed into his neck. Kieran pulled back, his silver eyes glowing with a fierce, terrifying light. He gripped my chin, forcing me to look at him. "You don't need a flower to be a wolf, Alara," he growled. "But you almost lost the one thing that makes you more powerful than any shifter in this pack." He looked toward the fortress, his expression turning lethal. The mistake was mine, but the betrayal was now his to settle. As he shielded me with his body, the wind died down for a split second, and I saw something in the shadows of the crevasse, a flicker of a woman's spirit, watching us with a sad, knowing smile. The truth was coming, but as Kieran carried me back through the snow, I realized the Shadow Throne wasn't just under threat from the outside. The traitor was already sitting at our table. The heat in my room was suffocating, or perhaps it was just the shame burning beneath my skin. Kieran had placed me in front of the hearth, wrapped in more furs than I could count, his own hands, still rough with the remnants of his partial shift, rubbing warmth back into my frozen limbs. He hadn't said a word since we entered the fortress. His silence was heavier than the blizzard. "I'm sorry," I whispered for the 10th time, my voice raspy. Kieran finally looked up. The silver in his eyes hadn't receded. "Vane told you about the bloom, didn't she?" I nodded slowly. "She said it would help me. She said I was a burden to you." Kieran stood abruptly, his shadow stretching long across the obsidian floor. "You are many things, Alara, but a burden is not one of them. Vane is an old thorn, but she knows more than she lets on. She didn't send you there to die. She sent you there to see if the mountain would claim what it once gave." He walked to the window, looking out at the jagged peaks. "Sleep now. The frost has bitten deep, and your mind needs the quiet." I wanted to argue, to ask what he meant by what the mountain gave, but my eyelids were leaden. As soon as he touched the door handle, I slipped into a sleep that felt less like rest and more like a descent. I wasn't in the Shadow Throne anymore. I stood in a field of tall, silver grass that swayed under a sky dominated by a massive, darkened moon. A halo of fire rimmed the black orb, a total solar eclipse. The air smelled of jasmine and ancient dust. "Alara," I turned. A woman stood there, her hair a waterfall of white light, her dress woven from the same silver grass. She didn't look like a wolf. She looked like the moon itself had taken a human shape. "Mother?" My voice was that of a child's. She smiled, and the sadness in her eyes was a reflection of my own. She reached out, her touch cool and soothing against my brow. My little star, they told you that you were broken because they could not hear the song in your blood. They measured you by the standards of predators, but you were never meant to be a hound of the pack. But I have no wolf, I sobbed, reaching for her. I have no scent. I'm nothing. You are everything, she whispered. The Crimson Peak was not your home. I hid you there, masking your scent with my own dying breath to keep you from the great shadow. You haven't shifted, Alara, because your spirit is not bound to a beast. You are eclipse-born, the bridge between the light and the dark. Your power does not lie in the claw, but in the command of the tides and the shadows. She gripped my hands, her expression turning urgent. The Alpha King knows. He didn't buy you at the auction. He rescued the only light that can stop the coming night. But the traitor in his court has opened the door to the dark forces. You must awaken, Alara, not for the king, but for the world that is about to go cold. How? I cried out as the silver grass began to wither into ash. How do I awaken? Look to the heart of the shadow, she said, her form beginning to dissolve into starlight. When the moon bleeds, the queen rises. I lunged forward, but she was gone. I woke with a gasp, my skin damp with cold sweat. The room was dark, the fire having died down to embers. But I wasn't alone. Kieran was sitting at the foot of my bed, his head in his hands. Kieran? He looked up, and for the first time I saw fear in the Alpha King's eyes. The southern borders have fallen, Alara. Not to wolves, but to something else. Shadows that walk like men. The Iron Citadel has made a pact with the void. I sat up, the memory of my mother's words ringing in my ears. They're coming for me, aren't they? Kieran stood and walked to the side of the bed, taking my hand. I've kept the truth from you to protect your peace. Your mother was the high priestess of the lunar cult, a bloodline thought extinct. You are the only one who can anchor the shield of the North. If they take you, the sun will never rise again. He led me out of the room and into the great hall. The council was already there, including a pale-faced Lady Vane. The atmosphere was electric with tension. The king claims this girl is our salvation, a grizzled elder barked, pointing a finger at me. She can't even scent a rogue at 10 paces. The void will swallow her whole. Kieran stepped forward, his voice a low, terrifying growl. She is the Eclipse-born, the daughter of the woman who held the dark forces back for 1,000 years. Her blood is the key to the Shadow Throne's true power. Vane stepped forward, her violet eyes narrowed. And how do we know this isn't just a king's fantasy to justify a wasteful purchase? If she is what you say, let her prove it. The void is at our gates. Let her step into the trial of the sunless path. If she survives, we follow. If not, she dies for nothing. Kieran finished, his grip on my hand tightening until it hurt. He looked down at me, the question silent in his silver eyes. He wouldn't force me. He would let me stay in the safety of the fortress while the world burned. I thought of my mother's spirit, the silver grass turning to ash. I thought of the auction block and the way Kieran had looked at me when no one else would. I'll do it, I said, my voice echoing in the vast, cold hall. The council gasped, and Vane's lip curled into a tiny, triumphant smile. I realized then that she expected me to fail. She wanted the trial to kill me, so she could take the throne in the vacuum of the king's grief. But as I looked at the dark moon through the high windows, I felt a strange, cold pull in my chest. The truth was out, but the awakening was yet to come. And as the distant sound of 1,000 scratching claws began to echo against the mountain walls, I knew the dark forces were no longer a threat, They were here. The sunless path was not a road, but an ancient, subterranean cathedral carved beneath the roots of the mountain. It was a place of absolute sensory deprivation, where the air felt like velvet and the silence was so heavy it pressed against my eardrums. Kieran walked with me to the massive iron-bound door, his hand resting on the small of my back, his heat the only thing keeping me grounded. "The trial isn't about fighting a monster, Ilara," Kieran whispered, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. "The sunless path shows you the parts of yourself you've spent your life trying to hide. The void will feed on your shame. It will tell you that you are the runt of the Crimson Peak again. You must find the light that exists when there is no sun." He stopped at the threshold. "I cannot follow you. If I step inside, the trial is forfeit, and the council will execute us both for heresy." I looked at the darkness beyond the door. "And if I don't come out?" Kieran's eyes flickered with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. This time, he didn't pull away. "Then I will tear this mountain down until I find you. My crown means nothing if the world it rules doesn't have you in it." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine for a fleeting, sacred second. Then, he stepped back and pulled the heavy iron lever. The door groaned open, revealing a yawning maw of ink. I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound of the locking bolt final as a coffin nail. At first there was nothing. No sound, no light, no scent. Then the whispers began. They didn't come from the walls. They came from my own mind. 10 silver pieces, the oily voice of the auctioneer hissed. A waste of space, a wolf who cannot hunt. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched. The air grew colder, a bone-deep chill that reminded me of the crevasse. Shadows began to coalesce in the dark, shapes that looked like my old pack members, their faces twisted into masks of mockery. "You're just a human in a costume, Ilara," a shadow version of Lady Vane sneered, her violet eyes glowing with a sickly light. "The king only wants your blood. Once he has the seal, he'll discard you like the runt you are." "That's not true," I gasped, clutching my mother's locket. The shadows lunged. They weren't solid, but their touch felt like ice water in my veins. They began to pull at me, dragging me down toward the floor of the abyss. I felt my strength failing. I was so tired of fighting to prove I was worthy of existing. Why not just let the dark take me? "When the moon bleeds, the queen rises." My mother's voice shattered the gloom. I looked up and saw a flicker of silver, not a torch, but a pulse within my own chest. It was the rhythm of the tides, the pull of the moon, the ancient power that had been suppressed by the masks I had worn to survive. I realized then that I had been trying to find a wolf's strength when I possessed the strength of the cosmos. I stood up, my legs trembling but firm. I stopped fighting the darkness. Instead, I reached out and pulled it in. As an eclipse born, the shadow was not my enemy. It was my element. "I am Ilara," I said, my voice projecting with a power that shook the very foundation of the mountain. "I am the daughter of the lunar eclipse. I do not fear the dark. I command it." A blinding flash of silver fire erupted from my skin. It wasn't the heat of the sun, but the cold, beautiful radiance of a total eclipse. The mocking shadows shrieked, dissolving into mist. The walls of the sunless path began to glow with ancient, glowing runes that had been dormant for centuries. But as my power flared, a sudden violent tremor rocked the cavern. It wasn't part of the trial. A high-pitched, feminine scream echoed from the great hall above, followed by the sound of stone shattering. Through the connection I now felt with the mountain, I sensed it. The seals had been sabotaged. The void wasn't waiting for the end of the trial. It had been let in. I ran toward the exit, my body trailing wisps of silver smoke. I slammed my hand against the stone door, and it didn't just open. It disintegrated under the weight of my power. I burst back into the great hall, but the scene was a nightmare. The high windows were shattered, and black, oily smoke was pouring into the room, taking the form of monstrous, multi-limbed horrors. The council was in disarray. In the center of the hall, Kieran was fighting with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. He was in his full wolf form, a massive, silver-eyed beast of black fur, tearing through the void spawn. But he was being flanked. Lady Vane stood near the king's throne, her hands glowing with a dark, necrotic purple. She wasn't just a traitor. She was the vessel. She was the one who had invited the void into the heart of the Shadow Throne. "The king dies tonight!" Vane shrieked, casting a bolt of dark energy at Kieran's back, while he was occupied with 3 monsters. "No!" I screamed. I didn't think. I leaped across the hall, my feet barely touching the floor. I didn't shift into a wolf, but as I moved, a cloak of pure starlight flared behind me. I threw my hand out, and a shield of silver light intercepted Vane's bolt, shattering it into harmless sparks. Kieran turned, his massive wolf head tilting as he saw me. The recognition in his eyes was replaced by awe. I stood between the king and the traitor, the air around me humming with the power of the eclipse. My eyes, once dull and human, were now glowing with the same crystalline silver as Kieran's. "The trial is over, Vane," I said, my voice resonant with the authority of the high priestesses. "And so is your time in this court." Vane snarled, her face contorting as the void energy within her began to ripple. "You think a little light can stop the night? The Iron Citadel is already at our gates. The world belongs to the Shadow now." Outside, a thunderous boom echoed as the main gates of the fortress were struck by something massive. The threat from the dark forces was no longer a prophecy. It was a siege. And as the void spawn began to swarm toward us, I realized the awakening was only the first step. The true sacrifice was yet to come. The fortress of the moon-shattered peak groaned as the main gates buckled. This was no longer just a skirmish with void spawn. The Iron Citadel had arrived in full force, led by the Hallowed, warriors whose souls had been replaced by the vacuum of the abyss. They poured through the breach like a tide of black ink, their armor clanking with a sound like rusted chains. Beside me, Kieran let out a roar that shook the soot-stained rafters. He shifted back into his human form for a moment, his chest heaving, his silver hair matted with the black ichor of the monsters he had slain. He looked at me, and despite the chaos, his eyes were soft. "The altar, Alara!" he shouted over the screams of the dying. "The heart of the Shadow Throne isn't the crown, it's the hearth. You must reach the ritual stone and channel the eclipse. If the void reaches the core, the north will crumble into ash." "I'm not leaving you!" I cried, my hands glowing with silver fire as I blasted a void spawn that tried to leap from the gallery. "You aren't leaving me," he said, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the secret passage behind the throne. "You are leading the way. I will hold the hall." He shoved me into the dark passage, just as Lady Vane unleashed a massive wave of necrotic energy. I saw her face, distorted, the purple veins of the void mapping her skin like a curse. She wasn't just a traitor anymore. She was a monster. The passage led to the very apex of the mountain, a stone dais open to the bleeding moon. Below me, I could hear the sounds of the massacre, the howls of the northern wolves, the chilling silence of the Hallowed, and the thundering roars of Kieran as he fought a losing battle against 100 foes. I reached the altar, a slab of ancient obsidian carved with the same runes I had seen in the sunless path. The moon above was now almost entirely black, the rim of fire dripping like blood into the sky. "Mother, help me," I whispered, pressing my bleeding palms to the stone. The mountain began to hum, a deep, tectonic vibration that resonated with the pulse in my chest. Silver light began to spiral upward from the altar, forming a pillar that reached toward the eclipse. I felt the power flowing through me, but it wasn't enough. The void was too heavy, too thick. Suddenly, the stone doors to the dais were blasted open. It wasn't Vane who stepped through. It was Kieran. He was in his human form, but he was unrecognizable. His raven cloak was shredded, and he was covered in deep, jagged wounds that bled gold, the blood of an Alpha King. He was staggering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, Vane appeared, her laughter echoing like glass breaking. "The king has fallen. The shadow throne is mine." She raised her hand, a spear of pure void energy forming in her palm, aimed directly at my heart. I was locked in the ritual, my spirit anchored to the altar. I couldn't move. I couldn't defend myself. "Kieran, no!" I screamed. Kieran didn't hesitate. With a final, agonizing burst of strength, he threw himself in front of me. The void spear didn't just strike him. It passed through him, erupting from his chest in a spray of golden sparks. He let out a choked sound, his silver eyes locking onto mine for one final, devastating second. "The light is yours, Ilara!" he choked out. He collapsed against the altar, his life force, the pure, ancient power of the Alpha King, flowing into the stone. The gold of his blood mixed with the silver of my light, creating a blinding white radiance that the world hadn't seen in 1,000 years. The sacrifice was complete. The white light exploded outward, a shockwave that swept down the mountain. I saw Vane shriek as the light touched her, her body dissolving into nothingness. The void spawn in the hall below were incinerated, the darkness purged from the stone. The Iron Citadel's army was thrown back from the gates, the Hollowed falling like puppets with their strings cut. The Shadow Throne was saved. The night was pushed back. But as the silver light faded, and the moon began to return to its pale, normal glow, the silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. I pulled myself away from the altar and crawled toward Kieran's still form. He lay on the cold obsidian, his skin the color of marble. The golden light in his eyes had faded. There was no breath, no heartbeat. "Kieran," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Kieran, please, wake up. I found my wolf. I found my light. You can't leave me now." I pulled his head into my lap, my tears falling onto his scarred face. The Alpha King, the man who had bought me when no one wanted me, the man who had seen a queen in a runt, was gone. Around us, the survivors began to trickle onto the dais. The elders, the warriors, even Lady Vane's former supporters, their heads bowed in shame and grief. But I didn't see them. I only saw the man who had given his life so that I could finally stand in my own. The air grew still, the snow falling gently on his cooling skin. I felt a hollow ache in my soul that no amount of cosmic power could fill. I was the Queen of the North, the daughter of the eclipse, and I was utterly alone. The dawn did not break with the usual harsh glare of the northern sun. Instead, it arrived as a soft, pearlescent glow, washing over the ruins of the moon-shattered peak. The fires had been extinguished by the silver rain that fell in the wake of the ritual, a celestial weeping that purified the stone of the void's oily residue. I remained on the obsidian dais, my knees bruised and my silk gown ruined, holding Kieran's head against my chest. The silver fire in my veins had settled into a low, mournful hum. Around us, the high-ranking members of the Northern Court stood in a wide circle, their weapons lowered, their eyes downcast. Elder Heron, the grizzled wolf, who had once called me a waste of space, stepped forward. He didn't look like a proud warrior anymore. He looked like an old man who had lost his son. He knelt, not out of duty, but out of a heavy, soul-deep realization. "The king is gone," Heron rasped, his voice cracking. "But the throne has its queen." I looked up, my vision blurred by tears. I didn't want a throne. I wanted him. "He knew," Heron said softly. "He knew the cost when he stepped into the path of the spear. An alpha king lives for his pack, but Kieran lived for the light he saw in you." The days that followed were a blur of gray and gold. The kingdom was in mourning, but there was work to be done. The hallowed had been purged, but the scars on the mountain and on the people were deep. I found myself thrust into the role of sovereign, not because I sought it, but because the mountain itself answered to my touch. When I walked through the corridors, the obsidian glowed with a soft silver light, a phantom echo of the bond I had shared with the man who was gone. The funeral was held at the height of the solar noon. We did not bury Kieran in the cold earth. We placed him on a pyre of white birch at the very edge of the summit, where the wind could carry his spirit back to the stars. The entire pack gathered. Thousands of wolves, from the lowliest servants to the high-born lords, stood in silence. I stood at the head of the pyre, wearing the raven cloak he had bought me, the only thing I had left of him. Kieran of the Shadow Throne was more than a king, I addressed the crowd, my voice amplified by the silver power that still thrummed in the air. He was a man who looked at the broken and saw beauty. He looked at the forgotten and saw a future. He gave his life not just to save a fortress, but to prove that light can bloom in the heart of the coldest winter. As I touched the torch to the wood, the flames didn't burn orange. They burned a brilliant, crystalline gold. I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. For a moment, in the dancing heat of the fire, I saw him. Not the scarred king, but a man made of light, standing tall and free. He looked at me, a small, proud smile touching his lips, and he nodded once, a final blessing, a passing of the torch. The succession was not a celebration. It was a solemn vow. That evening, I sat on the obsidian throne. It felt too big, too cold. The hall was quiet, the council waiting for my first decree. Lady Vane's supporters had been pardoned, provided they dedicated their lives to the restoration of the borders. The Iron Citadel was a ruin, their dark pact shattered. Horan approached the dais, carrying the crown of the Shadow Throne, a circlet of black iron set with a single, raw diamond. "The North is yours, Queen Alara," he said. "The wolves are waiting for your command." I looked at the crown. I thought of the auction block. I thought of the crevasse. I thought of the golden blood on my hands. "The North belongs to those who protect it," I said, my voice steady. "We will not rule through fear or bloodlines. We will rule through the light we carry for one another. That is the legacy of the King of Scars." I allowed him to place the crown on my head, but I didn't feel like a queen. I felt like a girl who was finally, painfully, awake. I looked out at the empty hall, my heart aching for a voice that wouldn't answer. But as the moon rose, casting a silver path across the floor, I felt a familiar, cold warmth, a ghost of a hand resting on my shoulder. I wasn't alone. I would never be alone again. The healing had begun, but the throne was a heavy weight to bear in the silence of the night. The first thaw of spring did not come with a violent crack of ice, but with a gentle, persistent warmth that bled from the stone walls of the moon-shattered peak itself. It was said by the elders that the mountain was breathing again, its obsidian heart synced to the steady, silver pulse of the queen who walked its halls. I stood on the balcony where I had once stood with Kieran, looking out over a kingdom that was no longer a fortress of isolation, but a sanctuary of light. The jagged scars of the void's assault were being covered by the creeping green of alpine moss and the sudden, defiant bloom of mountain lilies. The northern court had changed. It was no longer a hierarchy of the strongest jaw and the sharpest claw. I had opened the nurseries and the healing halls to every pup, regardless of their scent or the speed of their shift. We taught the young that power was a spectrum, that a wolf's strength could be found in the strategy of the mind or the empathy of the soul, just as much as in the fury of the hunt. One afternoon, I visited the lower settlement. A small boy, no more than 7, sat by a frozen fountain, his head in his hands. He was a runt of the gray stone pack, sent to the citadel for refinement, but returned because his wolf remained silent. I knelt beside him, my raven cloak, now trimmed with silver embroidery, sweeping the snow. "It's heavy, isn't it?" I asked softly. "The waiting." The boy looked up, his eyes wide. "They say I'm a ghost, Your Majesty, like you were." I reached out and took his small, cold hand in mine. A faint spark of silver light passed between us, a warmth that made him gasp. "You are not a ghost, little one. You are a star that hasn't found the night sky yet. Your wolf is not absent. He is simply waiting for a different kind of call." I watched him walk away, his shoulders a little higher, and I felt a quiet peace settle over me. This was the true succession. Not the iron crown on my head, but the hope I could plant in the hearts of the unwanted. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the world in gold and violet, I made my way to the silent crevasse. It was no longer a place of death. At the very edge of the precipice, where Kieran had once caught my hand, a single frostbite bloom grew. But it was different now. Its petals were no longer icy blue. They were a brilliant, shimmering gold, the color of the Alpha King's blood. I sat by the flower, the wind tugging at my hair. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the stone. "I'm doing my best, Kieran," I whispered into the stillness. The air grew still, and the scent of pine needles and a gathering storm, his scent, swirled around me. I didn't see a spirit, and I didn't hear a voice, but I felt a familiar, protective weight settle over my shoulders, as if an invisible cloak were being draped around me to keep out the chill. I looked up at the moon, which was now a perfect, glowing silver orb. Beside it, a single bright star pulsed with a golden rhythm. The eclipse was over, but the union of the sun and the moon remained in the sky, a permanent reminder that the light of the sacrifice would never truly fade. The Shadow Throne was no longer a place of shadows. It was a beacon. And as I walked back toward the lights of the fortress, I knew that the girl who was once Lot 49 had finally found the one thing no amount of black gold could ever buy. I was home, and I was whole. Ilara's journey reminds us that our value is never defined by those who fail to see our worth. She rose from the auction block to become the light of an entire kingdom, proving that even the most broken hearts can lead the way. If this story moved you, please show your support by liking the video and sharing it with someone who needs to find their own inner strength. Subscribe to our channel and join our community for more cinematic tales of destiny, romance, and the power of the soul. Until next time, remember, you are never truly unwanted.